Put on clean underwear before the attack. Sergeant Volkov said it like he was ordering breakfast. No emotion, no explanation. Just another fact you learned or you died. The recruit stared at him across the shell crater. Farm boy from Kursk, maybe 17, still had his mother's letter in his breast pocket. But, Comrade Sergeant, surely the medical science? The medics? Volkov spat. Kid, when Fritz opens up with that MG-42, you'll be lucky if the medics find enough pieces to identify. He lifted his tunic. 3 puckered scars ran across his ribs like pale rivers. Stalingrad. Dirty cloth from my shirt got dragged into the wound by the bullet, festered for 3 weeks. Nearly killed me. The recruit raised his hand like he was still in school. But, Comrade Sergeant, the academy taught us that tactical preparation requires... A bullet tears through dirty fabric and drags shit and piss into the wound. You die screaming from infection 3 days later. Volkov's voice was flat, matter of fact. Clean fabric? You might live. Around them, veterans were already stripping down, checking weapons, tightening straps, the rituals that kept you breathing. Before every attack, the sergeant continued, you put on clean underwear, you hear me? Clean. Your rifle might jam, your grenades might be duds, but clean underwear, that is something you control. The German MG-42 chattered in the distance. That sound every Soviet soldier learned to hate. 1,200 rounds per minute. The barrel change every few minutes. The Germans had turned industrial killing into a science, while the Red Army was still arguing about whether clean cotton could save your life. The whistle shrieked. Dmitri watched the kid scramble over the crater lip. Fresh meat for the grinder. In 30 seconds, he would learn what the manual never taught. That training meant nothing when the bullets started flying. That the veterans who survived were not the bravest or the most ideologically pure. They were the ones who listened to sergeants who smelled like gunpowder and spoke like undertakers. The MG-42 caught the kid 3 steps from the trench. He spun like a dancer and fell face first into the mud. Volkov was already moving to the next recruit. Another face, another pair of frightened eyes. Another boy who thought the commissar's speeches about invincible Soviet might meant something when the lead started flying. Clean underwear, he said again. The Red Army of 1941 was a machine designed to break itself. Stalin's purges had gutted the officer corps. The survivors were either terrified political appointees or grizzled sergeants who had learned to keep their mouths shut and their men alive. Volkov belonged to the second category. The recruits arrived from a dozen republics, speaking a dozen languages. Kazakhs who understood no Russian. Georgians who thought Moscow was another planet. Uzbeks whose officers gave orders in a language the men had never heard in their lives. The Wehrmacht exploited this ruthlessly. They learned to identify Soviet unit types by their attack patterns. Fresh conscripts moved like cattle. Veterans moved like wolves. The difference was written in body counts. Lieutenant Komarov had graduated 3rd in his class from the Frunze Military Academy. His assault plan was elegant on paper. A company-strength advance across 400 meters of open ground. Fix the enemy with direct fire. Close with bayonets. Overwhelming socialist determination would carry the day. The veterans tried to warn him. Sergeant Yegorov had survived Moscow and Stalingrad. He had watched what happened when doctrine met reality at high velocity. Comrade Lieutenant, the Germans have enfilade fire from that building. Interlocking positions. We need smoke. We need artillery preparation. We need to approach through the drainage line on the left flank. Komarov's voice carried the arrogance of inexperience. The manual is clear, Sergeant. Linear. Advance provides maximum firepower concentration. The enemy fears our revolutionary spirit. Yegorov exchanged glances with the other veterans. They had heard this speech before, from other lieutenants, who were now fertilizing the soil between here and Berlin. The company formed up at dawn, 43 men. textbook formation, parade ground precision. The MG-42 opened up at 300 meters. The distinctive sound filled the morning air like ripping cloth, but louder, much louder. The first wave dissolved like sugar in rain. Men dropped without drama, without the heroic gestures the Commissar films always showed. Just there. Then, not there. From his German position, Obergefreiter Müller watched through the smoke. He had been fighting Soviets for 2 years, had learned to distinguish green troops from veterans by the way they moved. These ones were following their training manual perfectly, which meant they would die according to schedule. Like cattle, his loader muttered. Müller had stopped counting months ago. The veterans scared him. They moved wrong, appeared where you did not expect them, used tactics no German manual described. But the fresh ones? They ran straight at his gun, screaming, dying. The after-action report was a masterpiece of Soviet bureaucracy. Casualties were within acceptable parameters. Enemy resistance was fierce, but yielded to heroic socialist determination. Lessons learned would be incorporated into future operations. No mention of the 36 bodies in the mud. No mention that Komarov had lasted 6 days before a mortar fragment ended his tactical theories permanently. V. Astafev would write about it later, after the war, when honesty was briefly fashionable. We simply did not know how to fight. We finished the war without knowing how to fight. We poured out our blood and threw back the enemy with our bodies. The brass hated that quote. Made them look incompetent. They were incompetent. The Red Army's learning curve was written in mass graves. Each disaster carved away the weak and the unlucky, and the ones who believed too strongly in doctrine over physics. What remained were harder men, quieter men, men who had learned that survival required abandoning everything they had been taught in favor of everything they could learn before the next bullet found them. Senior Scout Mansur Abdulin had crossed the Dnieper in September 1943 with his squad leader Shamrai. They had been together since Stalingrad. They had developed their own language of survival, hand signals, sound patterns, an intuitive understanding of when to move and when to wait that no training could provide. The river was wider than the Don, faster than the Volga. The Germans had been digging in on the far bank for weeks. Standard river assault, the briefing officer announced. Major Khrushchev, another academy graduate with perfectly pressed collar tabs. We establish a beachhead with the first wave, reinforce with follow-up, elements, then exploit success. Abdulin had heard similar briefings before the Volga crossings. Before the Dnieper, the results were always the same. Bodies floating downstream, and officers writing reports about unexpected resistance. But orders were orders. The crossing began at 3 in the morning. 40 wooden boats loaded with infantry, no artillery preparation because they did not want to announce the crossing. No air cover, just men with rifles trying to cross 800 meters of open water against prepared positions. The first boats made it halfway before the flares went up. German machine guns had the entire crossing site pre-registered. Mortars dropped rounds with mechanical precision. Searchlights turned night into day and exposed every boat like insects pinned to paper. The pot guns sank the boats before they reached midstream. Wooden hulls turned to splinters. Men disappeared into cold, dark water. "Stay in formation!" screamed the company commander. "Maintain! Assault line!" Men were dying. Boats were sinking. The assault line was dissolving into the muddy Dnieper. Abdulin and Shamrai looked at each other. "Fuck the assault line," Shamrai said. They went left instead of forward, away from the designated landing zone, found a small inlet protected by fallen trees, crawled through marsh water up to their necks. Took 40 minutes to move 200 meters. When they finally reached the German positions, they attacked from behind. 3 machine gun nests before anyone realized what was happening. The official report would call it initiative and tactical flexibility. The truth was simpler. They had learned to ignore orders and think for themselves. By dawn, 7 men from their company had established a foothold on the West Bank. Not where the plan said they should be. Not how doctrine suggested, but alive. The reinforcements that finally reached them found 20 men holding ground that 3 battalion-strength attacks could not take, through conventional assault. They called that stretch of riverbank the Island of Death, where the river ran red and no writer could describe what they had seen there. The German prisoners who came later, the ones who had defended those positions, asked through interpreters how the assault had been coordinated. No radio, no signals. How did they know when to advance? Shamrai had almost laughed. The Germans still thought in terms of doctrine and proper military procedure. They did not understand that the veterans had developed their own language, their own timing, their own brutal efficiency born from watching friends die following official procedures. "We learned to smell fear," Shamrai told the interpreter. "Your fear. When you are afraid, you make mistakes. When you make mistakes, you die." The multi-ethnic nature of Soviet forces made everything worse in those early years. Ukrainian infantrymen who understood Russian commands. Kazakh herders who followed Georgian officers whose accents made their orders unintelligible. Uzbek soldiers whose sergeants communicated through gestures because words had stopped working somewhere east of Kharkov. The Wehrmacht exploited this with the mechanical efficiency they brought to all forms of killing. But survival has its own language. By 1943, veteran units had developed communication systems that bypassed the chaos. Not official systems, not approved procedures. Battlefield evolution. The kind that happens when the alternative is dying because your comrade did not understand what you screamed at him across 30 meters of no man's land. The clean underwear rule was just the beginning. Corporal Denisov had survived 3 months of German counter-battery fire at Kursk. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand and had a permanent ringing in his ears that never went away. He was also the man most likely to still be breathing when the smoke cleared. "You sit on the firing step," he explained to the replacement squad, settling into the trench with practiced ease. "But your legs go into the deeper hole in the center." The technique looked awkward, uncomfortable. Academy officers called it undisciplined, cowering instead of maintaining proper defensive posture. "Even if a tank rolls over this position, your legs are protected," Denisov continued. "If a shell lands directly in the trench, the blast goes up, not sideways. Your legs are below the fragmentation pattern. You might get concussed, but you will live to fight tomorrow." Private Fedorov raised his hand. "Sergeant, Lieutenant Petrov says we should lie flat against the trench wall during shelling." Denisov spat in the mud. "Lieutenant Petrov graduated 3 months ago. I graduated at Stalingrad. Who do you want to trust?" The friction between veteran knowledge and officer doctrine created its own casualties. Units that ignored experienced sergeants died faster. But questioning tactics was dangerously close to defeatism. And defeatism was treason. And treason was a bullet in the back of the head from your own commissar. So veterans found ways to delay. Equipment failures, communications breakdowns, mysterious ammunition shortages, creative interpretations of doctrine that somehow resulted in men doing exactly what the veterans wanted them to do, while the paperwork said something else entirely. The German counterattack came at dawn. 2 companies of Wehrmacht infantry, supported by armor and preceded by the heaviest artillery barrage Volkov had experienced since the siege of Stalingrad. For 20 minutes, the earth shook like it was trying to throw off the weight of every sin committed upon it. 105mm howitzers, 150mm guns firing on pre-registered targets. Fragments of metal filled the air in patterns calculated by men who had made a science of killing other men efficiently. Volkov sat in his modified position with his legs in the deep hole and his helmet pulled low. Shrapnel rang off his steel, dirt cascaded from the trench walls. The concussion waves hit like invisible hammers. But he was still alive, still conscious, still capable of fighting. The squad to his left had maintained proper regulation foxhole construction, direct hit from a 150 shell. There was nothing left worth identifying. When the barrage lifted and the German infantry came forward, 11 of his 12 men were still able to fight. The squad that had followed manual procedures was simply gone. Lieutenant Petrov survived the counterattack. He had taken cover in Volkov's position when the shells started falling. He was writing his after-action report with hands that still shook from the bombardment when Volkov came to speak with him. "Comrade Lieutenant," Volkov said carefully, "about those foxhole modifications." Petrov looked up. For the first time since arriving from the academy, he looked like he might be willing to learn something. "Show me," he said. 800 frostbite casualties per day. That was the price the 6th Panzer Division paid for following doctrine in conditions that killed faster than bullets. -49 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. The kind of cold that killed engines and froze weapons and turned men into stumbling statues long before they reached the enemy. Hauptmann Weber had been fighting on the Eastern Front for 2 winters. He had learned that cold weather operations required adaptation that no training manual covered. Standard entrenching tools bounced off the frozen ground without leaving a mark. Permafrost 3 feet deep. No shelter. No natural cover. Just flat steppe stretching to the horizon, swept by winds that stripped flesh from bone. "Break out the demolitions," Weber ordered. His company commander raised an eyebrow. "Explosives? For foxholes? Small charges, spaced in lines. The explosions will fracture the frozen ground enough to dig proper positions." The supply officer was horrified. Explosives were for attacking enemy bunkers, not creating improvised shelter. The regimental commander complained it looked like a moonscape. Engineering doctrine was very clear about the proper use of demolition materials. Weber looked at the frozen bodies being carried to the rear. Men from companies that had tried to fight winter with approved techniques and regulation equipment. "Dead soldiers cannot fight enemy armor, Herr Oberst." By morning, Weber's company had constructed a defensive line that would keep them alive through the night. Crude positions, improvised shelters, but functional. The units following standard doctrine were reporting massive frostbite casualties and combat ineffective strength. By December, every veteran unit on the Eastern Front was using similar techniques. Explosive excavation became standard procedure. Not because some staff officer had written a manual about it, but because the alternative was watching your men freeze to death following regulations written by people who had never experienced -50 weather. Oberst Heinrich Brenner commanded a Tiger battalion, 60 tons of armor, the most feared tank in the Wehrmacht arsenal. He had broken Soviet positions from Kursk to Kiev with nothing but audacity and high-velocity shells. He believed in the power of concentrated armor to smash through any defense. The Oerscholz switch line was 3 kilometers of interlocking bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, prepared positions designed by engineers and manned by veterans who had learned to kill tigers. "The 90th Infantry Division is 30 minutes out," his adjutant reported. "They can provide support for the attack." Brenner waved him off. Tigers do not wait for foot soldiers. It was the same arrogance that had carried German armor across Poland and France and deep into Russia. Concentrate your tanks. Hit the enemy before they can coordinate a response. Trust in technical superiority and shock action. The Americans had been expecting the attack for weeks. They had studied German tactics, prepared countermeasures. The anti-tank guns were pre-positioned with overlapping fields of fire. The minefields channeled German armor into killing zones. Infantry teams waited in shell holes with bazookas and nerves steady enough to let 60-ton monsters roll past their positions. At 800 meters, the lead Tiger struck a teller mine, immobilized, crew bailing out into American machine gun fire. At 400 meters, the shaped charge warheads started flying. 2 more Tigers died in 60 seconds. Ammunition explosions, secondary fires. The kind of catastrophic kills that sent black smoke columns high into the gray sky. "Pull back!" shouted Hauptfeldwebel-Müller. "We are walking into a trap." But Brenner was committed. The textbook said concentrated attacks could overwhelm any defensive position. The textbook did not account for defenders who had read the same textbook and prepared accordingly. The attack collapsed within 10 minutes. 7 Tigers destroyed or immobilized. 12 casualties among irreplaceable veteran crews. A battalion reduced to company strength by one man's refusal to accept tactical reality. The 90th Infantry Division arrived to find Brenner's surviving Tigers pulling back in disorder, leaving their dead behind. "What happened?" the infantry commander asked Müller. "They were ready for us," Müller said. It was the simplest and most complete answer available. The Wehrmacht's tactical advantages were evaporating. Air superiority, technical superiority, training superiority. All neutralized by enemies who had adapted their doctrine to counter German methods. The Tiger Division died by the book. The breakthrough never happened. And 12 of Germany's finest tank crews were killed because their commander could not admit that textbook tactics do not work when the enemy has read your textbook. Lieutenant William Collins stared at the Panther turret through his periscope and thought about everything the training manuals had taught him. Then he thought about everything they had not taught him. There was considerably more of the second category. The German tank was holed down behind a stone wall, perfect defensive position, overlapping fields of fire with 2 other Panthers, interlocking support from infantry positions. The crossroads had been a killing ground for 3 days. 2 previous flanking attempts had resulted in knocked out Shermans and burned crews. "Sir," Collins' gunner reported over the intercom, "we have positive identification on the target. Panther tank, hold down position behind the wall." Collins understood the tactical situation completely. A 1 M4 Sherman against a prepared Panther position. The outcome was mathematically predetermined. His 76mm gun could penetrate Panther side armor at reasonable range. The Panther's gun could turn his tank into scrap metal and cremated crew from 800 meters. The textbook said coordinate with infantry, use artillery support, employ smoke screens and multiple vectors of approach. The textbook was correct. The textbook was also not here. Driver, advance to the smoke deployment point. Gunner, load smoke. His crew had been with him since Normandy. They had learned to trust his judgment in the particular way that soldiers trust commanders who have kept them alive longer than statistical probability suggested was possible. They did not ask questions. They did not point out that what he was about to do violated every principle of armored warfare. They followed orders, and they kept their fear quiet and professional. White phosphorus smoke billowed across the battlefield. Visibility dropped to nothing. The Panther's superior optics meant exactly nothing when they were looking at a wall of chemical fog. Collins was not retreating, he was advancing. Guided only by compass bearing and terrain memory, the Sherman charged directly at the Panther position. This violated everything. You did not attack superior enemy tanks head-on. You did not advance through concealing smoke that blinded you as much as the enemy. You did not stake your crew's lives on the possibility that desperate measures succeeded where textbook approaches failed. Sometimes they did. The Sherman burst through the smoke 50 meters from the Panther. Too close for the German gunner to properly traverse his turret. Too close for escape. First shot missed. Rushed aim and the shock of sudden target acquisition. The 76mm round sparked off the Panther's frontal armor without effect. The German crew was scrambling, turret traverse motors whining. The Panther was trying to bring its gun around, but the Sherman was inside their comfortable engagement envelope now. Too close for careful shooting. Second shot. Another miss. Now the Panther's gun was coming around. In seconds, Collins would be looking down the barrel of the KWK-42. The math would resolve itself in the Germans' favor. Third round. Take your time. The gunner controlled his breathing. Smooth trigger pull. Everything gunnery school had taught him about proper technique. Miss, high, and right. The Panther's barrel was almost on them. German infantry was moving to support their tank. The situation was deteriorating through the familiar stages toward catastrophe. Fourth round, now. The armor-piercing shell struck the Panther's turret mantle. Penetration. Secondary explosion as German ammunition cooked off. The enemy tank erupted in flames that reached 40 feet into the gray sky. Collins's crew sat in stunned silence for a moment. "Sir," the gunner finally said, "how did you know that would work?" Collins looked at the burning Panther, at the crossroads that was finally open to Allied advance, at the tactical situation that had seemed hopeless 20 minutes earlier. "I did not," he said. But conventional tactics were not working either. The after-action report credited superior American gunnery and aggressive leadership. It did not mention the 4 misses. It did not mention the margin between success and catastrophe that could have been measured in milliseconds. It did not mention that Collins had violated every principle of armored warfare and survived only because desperate measures sometimes succeed where calculated approaches fail. But the German tankers who witnessed it would remember. The ones who lived through the engagement would pass the lesson to replacement crews. American commanders were getting more aggressive, more willing to take risks that should have killed them. The technical advantages that had carried German armor through the early years of the war were being neutralized by enemies who had adapted their tactics, who had learned from their defeats, who understood that superior equipment meant nothing if the crews operating it were dead. The learning curve was flattening, and on the wrong side. By the winter of 1943, the Red Army had evolved into something unrecognizable from the force that had retreated in panic during Barbarossa. The academy graduates were mostly dead. The commissars had learned to shut up and let the fighters fight. The survivors had written their own manual in blood and steel. Volkov commanded a rifle company now, not because of promotion or political favor, but because everyone senior to him was dead. The officers with pressed uniforms and theoretical knowledge. The political officers with their revolutionary speeches and execution orders. The career soldiers who had believed in regulations and proper procedure. All gone, replaced by men who had learned that survival required adaptation. "Comrade Captain," his new political officer said, Senior Lieutenant Maxim, fresh from Moscow. Another believer in doctrine and ideological purity. The men are not following proper assault procedures. The manual clearly states massed formation attacks with coordinated advance. Volkov looked at his troops preparing for the next attack. They moved with economical efficiency. No wasted motion. No parade ground precision. Just competent soldiers who knew their business. They wore clean underwear before combat. They dug their foxholes with legs in the hole modifications. They ignored half the orders from higher headquarters and improvised the rest. They had learned to fight the war that existed rather than the war that theory demanded. The manual was written by dead men, comrade. My soldiers are alive. Senior Scout Abdulin had found the German command bunker at the Dnieper position by following telephone wires. 3 guards, professional work, quiet work. By dawn, Abdulin and his team controlled a 400-meter section of German river line. Not because they had followed doctrine, but because Shamrai understood that desperate situations required desperate measures. Because sometimes the impossible worked when the possible got you killed. The official report would mention the breakthrough without mentioning how it happened. It would not mention that 7 survivors accomplished what 3 battalion-strength attacks could not. It would not mention that the men who achieved it had done so by ignoring every order they had been given. But the veterans knew. The ones who lived long enough to learn. They passed the lessons along in whispers and blood stories. Do not follow the textbook when the textbook gets you killed. Do not trust officers who have never heard a shot fired in anger. Do not die for someone else's career advancement. The clean underwear rule spread through veteran units, not through official channels or training manuals, but through the informal network of survivors who passed along hard-earned knowledge. Stay alive long enough, and other veterans would teach you their tricks. The legs in the hole technique became standard procedure among experienced troops. Officers who tried to enforce regulation foxhole construction found their orders ignored. Sergeants who had survived German artillery barrages carried more authority than lieutenants fresh from military school. Innovation born from desperation became doctrine born from experience. The Red Army had started the war as a rigid, doctrinally bound force that collapsed under the weight of its own inflexibility. It would end the war as perhaps the most tactically adaptable army in the world. The survivors had not kept their uniforms. They had changed everything else: doctrine, tactics, methods, mindset. They had learned with their own blood, and now they were teaching. Volkov's company attacked at dawn, not in massed waves like the early war disasters. In small groups using cover and mutual support. They used smoke for concealment, coordinated infantry and armor support, adapted their tactics to terrain and enemy dispositions. Most importantly, they ignored orders that would get them killed. The Wehrmacht positions fell within 2 hours, not because of superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but because Soviet soldiers finally knew how to fight. "Comrade Captain, this is not proper Soviet tactical doctrine," Maxim complained, watching the German prisoners being marched to the rear. Volkov looked at his casualties, lighter than they had been in months, at soldiers who had survived because they had learned to think for themselves. "No," he agreed, "it is better." The irony was complete. The Red Army had started the war as a rigid, ideology-bound force that collapsed under German pressure. It ended the war as perhaps the most tactically flexible army in the conflict. The survivors had paid for their education with mass casualties and tactical disasters. But they had learned. The Germans, who had started with tactical superiority and operational flexibility, had become increasingly rigid. Hitler's interference, no retreat orders, doctrine that could not adapt to changing circumstances. By 1944, it was German units marching into prepared positions with predictable tactics. German officers following manual procedures while their enemies innovated around them. The Wehrmacht was still technically competent. Their equipment remained superior in many categories. Their individual soldiers were well trained and experienced, but they had stopped learning. And in warfare, the side that stops adapting starts dying. By April 1945, Volkov's company had reached the outskirts of Berlin. Of the original 43 men who had started with him at Kursk, 3 survived the entire campaign. The rest were casualties, transfers, or promotions to units that needed experienced sergeants. But those 3 men represented something unprecedented in military history. They were veterans of the largest land campaign ever fought. Soldiers who had learned to fight the most, technically advanced army in the world, and beat it at its own game. They had learned with their own blood, and that education had proved more valuable than all the manuals and doctrine and theoretical knowledge that 4 years of war had produced. The final lesson was not complicated. In warfare, adaptation beats doctrine. Flexibility defeats rigid procedure. And soldiers who learn from their mistakes will eventually defeat soldiers who repeat theirs. It had taken 4 years and 27 million casualties for the Red Army to understand this. But once understood, it proved decisive. The men who survived to see Berlin knew something their academy-trained officers had never grasped. War is not fought in classrooms or on parade grounds. It is fought by soldiers who learn to improvise, to adapt, to find solutions in the dark when the textbook is burning. Everything else is just theory, and theory does not stop bullets. Volkov pulled a fresh pair of cotton shorts from his pack on the morning of the final assault. Standard issue, washed in melted snow 2 days ago. He dressed with the calm efficiency of a man performing a ritual whose importance he understood completely. Private Komarov, young enough to be his son, watched him with the expression of a soldier who had survived long enough to know better than to ask stupid questions. "Clean underwear," Volkov said simply. Every time. The boy nodded. He had learned. That was how knowledge transferred in combat. Not through classroom instruction or approved training manuals. Through survival. Through watching what kept men breathing. Through the quiet authority of veterans who carried their expertise in scars and habits, and the particular stillness of men who had already made peace with dying and simply kept choosing not to. The techniques that kept you alive got passed along. The techniques that killed you died with their practitioners. And somewhere in that brutal arithmetic, the Red Army had found its education. V. Astafev would write the truth after the war. We simply did not know how to fight. We finished the war without knowing how to fight. We poured out our blood and threw back the enemy with our bodies. He was almost right. Some of them did learn to fight. The ones who survived the meat grinder developed their own deadly competence. They learned to fight like Germans, but think like Russians. To use Soviet numbers and German methods. To combine revolutionary courage with professional skill. The Germans called them terrible opponents, not because of their political ideology, but because of what they had become after years of fighting. Units that had been blooded in the cauldron battles and emerged as effective killing machines. Veterans who had learned their trade in the hardest school of all. And it started with clean underwear, because that was the first lesson. The one that preceded everything. The one that said, the details matter. The small things matter. The difference between dying from infection 3 days after a survivable wound and walking out of the war on your own feet, that difference lives in the details that doctrine ignores and manuals never mention. Pay attention to the details. Listen to the men who have already bled for their knowledge. Adapt before the next bullet teaches you the lesson the hard way. That was what the survivors carried out of the most expensive education in human history. That was what Sergeant Volkov had learned watching Dmitri die at the beginning. What Abdulin had learned swimming through ice water in the Dnieper darkness. What Collins had learned navigating blind through his own smokescreen toward a tank that should have killed him. The war would be won not by those who followed orders perfectly, but by those who survived long enough to understand which orders were worth following. Volkov watched the morning light catch the ruins of Berlin. He thought about the boy with his mother's letter, about the academy officers with their pressed uniforms and their theories, about the millions of men who had paid tuition they could not afford for lessons that should have been taught before the first shot was ever fired. Then he shouldered his weapon and moved forward. Because that was also something you learned. You survived the last lesson, and then you walk toward the next one. With clean underwear, and your legs in the hole, and your rifle clean, and your eyes open. That was all there was to it. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.